My name is Joe. Welcome to my channel. On this channel, we talk a lot about Christian history, Christian apologetics. I'm coming specifically from an Anglican perspective. That's the denomination of Christianity to which I belong. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the history of the Thoma Church, which is a understated element of the Anglican Communion all the way over in India. For what it's worth, the Anglican Communion is called that normatively. It has to do with the naming of relating it to England or the Mother Church of England, mostly because that's where the instruments of communion are, or historically that's where the instruments of communion, as they're called, are. Usually the Archbishop of Canterbury is called the primus inter pares, if you will, kind of the first among equals of all of the bishops in the Anglican Communion. But they are all fundamentally equals, and especially in the last couple, really decade and a half, the instruments of communion have been changing. The communion has been broadening, and so especially in the global South, as it's called, the parts of and especially in the parts of the Anglican Communion that are not in the classical West, and by that I mean Western Europe, North America, they're becoming more dominant. Those churches are becoming more dominant in the communion. And so knowing about them, understanding them might be more relevant. And additionally, it starts to bring up how apt the name Anglican even really is for this communion. Because as time goes on, it gets less, Anglican, less Anglo-Saxon. But just to kind of broaden our perspective, let's talk about the Thoma Church. So originally, St. Thomas, who's one of the 12 apostles, eventually moves to India to evangelize amongst Indian Jews. There's a small population of Jews in India where he has a successful evangelism mission. A side note about Christian history and Christian apologetics, most of the small communities where Christianity was first able to be successful, there were already small pockets of Jews who had spread out in the diaspora of the Jews beforehand. So you can look, by the way, at Ethiopia. There was also a small diaspora of Jews there that were kind of a soft bed for the evangelism that would become a new Christian church. And so there's no difference in India, especially in what's called the Malabar Coast. There is a Jewish population there, and then there's quickly a Christian population called the St. Thomas Christians. St. Thomas, according to church tradition, found 7 Christian communities at the center of this Indian Christian church, really. And they would have considered themselves a part of the same church, really. And they would have considered themselves a part of the small c Catholic Church, universal church, especially in the first couple hundred years. It was still largely separate, though, from most of the rest of especially Western Christianity. There was some contact and relationship with the churches in Persia, but as Islam kind of sweeps through the Middle East and kind of chops Christendom in half in that sense, the Indian Christians are kind of on their own, vaguely separated, with still kind of tenuous contact with the rest of the Christians in the world. But just very, very mitigated contact with those Christians. Not in the same kind of level of contiguous exposure that, say, the church in Constantinople obviously will have as a center. Now, despite that, before all of this, they were pretty connected. There's a record in the Council of Nicaea of a Bishop John of India, who was apparently present at the Council of Nicaea. And for centuries, basically, this Indian church was evangelizing people all over India, not just on the Malabar Coast, to some, marginal success. And Christians in the very pluralistic, very religiously diverse environment of India were one of the religions, if a small one, in India at this time. However, about 1,000 years later, Portuguese explorers show up in this area of India with Indian Christians and all of this, and begin interacting and seeing where they agree, where they disagree. So throughout the 16th and 17th century, these Portuguese Christians start having a relationship, especially headed by the Jesuits. The Jesuits have a lot of influence in this kind of dynamic, this growing relationship between the Portuguese and the St. Thomas Christians. So eventually, they bring over a Portuguese bishop in the Archbishop of Goa to kind of have a formal relationship with the Thoma Christians. And in 1599, the Portuguese Archbishop held a synod called the Synod of Diamper, where they sought to make the local St. Thomas Christians submit to the Pope's jurisdiction. They sought to recognize the Pope as the head of the Catholic Church, and to accept a number of Latinizing liturgical reforms, and notably one that had the most pushback was the insistence on clerical celibacy in the St. Thomas Christian churches. Even today, by the way, most Roman historians, Roman Catholic historians, including the 1913 Catholic Encyclopedia, acknowledge that the misguided Portuguese were kind of doing this for imperialistic purposes. They were trying to basically turn them into Portuguese imperial subjects through the Synod of the Emperor. So for about 50 years, the Jesuits and the Archbishop here basically had an inquisition to impose the Synod of the Emperor, in some areas with some success, in other areas with more resistance. But over about 50 years, resistance started to mount against the Synod of the Emperor. By 1653, leadership from the Thoma Church met at what's called the Cunin Cross, which is in a famous cathedral, and swore a public oath together, creatively called the Cunin Cross Oath, which opposed the influence of the Jesuits over the church and resisted these liturgical reforms and, got rid of clerical celibacy, especially because in the Thoma tradition, there were a number of important priestly families. So these families intended on continuing their lineages, obviously, so clerical celibacy would kind of cut the influence of these priestly families in the St. Thomas Church. So the Cunin Cross Oath then binds a bunch of these priests together, especially some of these notable priestly families, to oppose the Portuguese and the Jesuits, and they write this oath. It's geared towards the Bishop of Rome, and notably they don't outright say the Pope is the Antichrist or anything like that. What they say is that the Jesuits are equally a threat to them, St. Thomas Christians, as they are to the Bishop of Rome. Obviously, some people will try to argue that they didn't deny papal infallibility or this, that, and the other thing, but basically they argue that the Jesuits are attacking the church, and this is what they need to break off or not submit to the Archbishop of Goa anymore. Basically, then 4 months after the Cunin Cross Oath, they create their own archdeacon, whose name is Thoma I, and he is the kind of first archdeacon. Eventually, and they recognize him as opposed to the Archbishop. I believe it's Archbishop Garcia, and they kind of start their own. Or not really start their own, but they break communion with the Archbishop of Goa. About 400 Christians, according to tradition, stayed with the Archbishop of Goa, while the rest of the St. Thomas Christians went with the Archdeacon Thoma. The official website of the Thoma Church puts it this way. What they wanted was to remain loyal to their ancient faith and traditions. Their dream was finally materialized when their Archdeacon Thomas, by name, was duly consecrated with the title Thoma in 1665 by Mar Gregorius of Jerusalem, who was associated with the Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch. Thus, the episcopal continuity was restored with Thoma I as the first Indian metropolitan. So he goes from being an archdeacon to being an archbishop because he gets that kind of laying on of hands from a group of, I believe, Antiochian Christians who have episcopal succession and all of that. Then they kind of do their own thing. And he is the first Indian metropolitan, so basically a patriarch in this sense. Today, 3 different churches which claim, direct lineage and inheritance from these St. Thomas Christians who were led by Thoma I are in communion with the Anglican Communion. Those 3 churches which have various contiguous origins in the Thoma Church are the Thoma Syrian Church. It's called Syrian because of their liturgy. The St. Thomas Evangelical Church and the Church of South India all have communities, churches, episcopal succession from that Thoma Christian community. And they've since jurisdictionally been divided, those churches, as India has grown, as the Christian community in India has grown. You might ask, how did this happen? Why are all these churches in the Anglican communion? Well, by the beginning of the 19th century, there was an internal reform movement in the Thoma Church. So people were upset about the lack of lay devotion, the lack of evangelization, and the kind of lack of importance of scripture. There were some local variety of reformers across India, across Mar churches, who were upset with the status of, kind of the lack of individual piety in the Mar church at that time. And there was kind of a revival movement, a lot of re-emphasis on Bible reading in church houses and all these kinds of things. And there was internal reform in this way. So there were bishops and priests who were leading this reform movement over and against some other internal forces and authorities. So when they're eventually put in contact again with some of the European Protestant groups, they start to notice some similarities between their movement and the European Protestant movement. And of course, there were notable differences. And, this video is definitely an overview and not a scholarly article or anything. And you can look this up yourself. There are tons of books and go into incredible detail about all these things. But there were definitely differences. But there were some stark similarities. Emphasis. A lot of the theologians were emphasizing grace. They were worried about the kind of ipso facto suspicion way that a lot of the sacraments were being treated, and basically wanted to restore a lot of the same emphases of the Protestant Reformation in India. So those bishops and priests associated with the Mar Church, who were kind of pro-reform, all these things, favored and courted relationships with a lot of Protestant groups in Europe. But what they were dismayed to find out is that of all of the Protestant groups, the only Protestant group that actually continued apostolic succession, had a kind of episcopal threefold ministry, which they thought was biblical, traditional, and all these important things, was the Anglican Communion. Now, that didn't mean that there weren't some groups who thought these were important or weren't important, but at the end of the day, to kind of unify all these diverse reformer ideas in the Mar Church, as opposed to kind of splitting off and doing their own thing for each and every specific persuasion, they decided, okay, well, to appease the faction of us who really care about episcopal continuity and all these things, let's start talking with the Anglicans. And of course, at this time, if you know anything about the history of India, right, this is the 19th century, the influence, this is a very early 19th century, I think late 18th century as well, the influence of the British in this part of India is growing rapidly at this time too. So there's some kind of political concerns in the same way, and there's political concerns in both ways, of course, because if you can see the parallels maybe between this moment, and they're saying they're going to appeal to communion with Christians outside of India, there's some kind of harrowing reminders of the situation that they were in back in the 16th and the 17th century with the Portuguese. But eventually, lots of talks are made. They have conversations about, what do you believe? What do we believe about God, about the sacraments, all this stuff. And a significant portion of the reformers that and bishops and priests and the organs of the church that agreed with the reform movement willingly entered into communion with the Anglicans, and they maintain their own, structures. They maintain their own churches. They maintain their own liturgy. Nothing really changed functionally for these groups, but now they were willing to share communion with the Anglican communion. And ever since then, we've been in communion, pretty much unabridged. And there's some fun differences between the way that the Mar Thoma liturgy is practiced and the Anglican liturgy is practiced, of course. But the theology, they agreed, was pretty much the same, which I think is such an amazing, witness to our doctrines and our theology that I'm always surprised people don't bring up enough. The idea that there were these Christians who were living halfway across the world, that when, the Anglicans met up with them, they started comparing notes basically and said, hey, we kind of agree on all this theological stuff, despite being separated by time and mutual doctrinal development and all those kinds of things. Now, of course, this isn't to say that there weren't Mar Thoma churches that didn't follow into this into communion with the Anglicans. I believe there are Mar Thoma churches now in the Orthodox communion, and there are Mar Thoma churches in the Catholic communion and in the Oriental Orthodox communion. But a significant portion of them are in, have been in, and continue to be in communion with the so-called Anglican global communion. Some of the differences, if you're interested, between the Mar Thoma liturgy, which is related to the Eastern Syriac liturgy, there's some vestment differences, and there's some practical liturgical differences. So their divine service, their liturgy, their mass, if you will, is called Holy Kurbana, and they have a kind of quasi leavened bread, unleavened bread situation too, which I always think is so interesting, right? Because if you're coming from the Western versus Eastern way of thinking, it's like, okay, well, in the West you've got unleavened bread, and in the East you've got leavened bread. What do they have in this separate, segregated Indian Christian community? Well, in this Indian Christian community, they have what is effectively leavened bread, but they use a type of, I'm going to mess this up. They use a type of what's called holy malka, which is like a special mix of ingredients and chemicals to cause the bread to kind of become thick and rise, but it's actually not yeast and it's not properly leavened, if that makes sense. So they found a good middle way, truly a via media, if you will. They were Anglican in spirit before that was even a thing. So I think that's super interesting. In addition, some of the different clerical vestments and robes are that you'll notice if you look up like the metropolitan of the Martoma Church in India, he's got a crown and he's got this big cape and everything, and he looks kind of different and kind of the same, right? The crown looks kind of like a mitre to Western bishops. Now, the crown is definitely the more distinct element of the dress here in the Martoma Church. So the Martoma website also has an explanation, which I think is nice, about what the difference of the liturgical vestments are. And so I'm going to read it now. They write, the priest wears the brightly lit royal robes and the crowns or golden coverings on the head because all of the worshiping community is a royal priesthood, kings and priests. In the Revelation picture, we have the 24 elders wearing the golden crowns. As the bishops enter into the presence on behalf of the church, he covers his head. This is often criticized on the basis of the statement that a man should not cover his head. The symbolism here is far different. Bishops do not represent himself. The bishop, it's a translation from, I imagine, a different language into English, so bear with it. Represent himself as a man. He represents the church. The church is the bride of the Lamb, and the bride covers her head as a mark of respect to the groom, Christ. Notice that the bishops do not do that only when he is facing the throne and at occasions representing the church as a whole. I think that's super interesting. And there's probably way more you can find out about Martoma Christianity and all the different communities that follow the kind of Martoma liturgical traditions and whatnot. But I found out about this the other day, and I thought it was super interesting. I'd kind of known, oh yeah, there are churches that are in communion with the Anglicans who weren't, planted by some Anglo-Saxon group, but didn't really know a lot about them or why they were in our communion or what that meant or how that happened. So I did a little bit of research and I kind of made this video. I'm wondering if people find this interesting. I think it's super cool. I think it's one of the, if we can come to an age, an era of trying to talk about exegesis, eisegesis, right? The idea that, oh, well, let's separate two Christian groups, let's let them develop on their own for thousands of years and then get them back together. And if they, growing in completely different cultural contexts on the other sides of the world, and then the fact that they come back together and then without force of compulsion or anything liturgical like that or any kind of authority, making them agree, they find they already did agree. And then they can enter into communion because of that agreement, that genuine theological agreement. Now, from what I understand, the difference between those three different Martoma churches that are in the Anglican communion is that the aforenamed Martoma Syrian church or Syriac church is that they're just, Martoma churches, versus the others were kind of union churches of, some Anglicans, especially after independence. There were like local Anglican plants from British missionaries and then Martoma churches, and then even I believe some Presbyterian churches that came together after independence, like the Church of South India and also the Church of North India. But I noticed that the Church of North India didn't claim to have Martoma relationships like the Church of South India did. I'm wondering if that could just be a mistake of my research or what, but I didn't mention them because I couldn't find anything that of them claiming to have Martoma heritage, but they're also in the Anglican communion. I think they're mostly just planted by Anglican missionaries, though. And I think that's just about everything. I do think it's also interesting to see that the threefold ministry, bishop, priest, deacon, that form of the church still existed even in these far-flung provinces of Christendom. So if you found that interesting, if you want to learn out more about the Thoma Church, you should totally look it up and you should do some research for yourself. If you want to see more videos on my channel about Christianity, Christian history, Christian apologetics, American history, I talk about lots of stuff on this channel. Be sure to subscribe. If you want to support me, you can support me at younganglican.local. All right, thank you so much for watching. God bless. Have a great day.